welcome to the Fusebox in Brighton. We're here today as part of the Economic and Social Research Council's Festival of Social Science 2020, and we thank the ESRC for their support with this event. The title of today's programme is Communities, Technologies and Democratic Innovation, and we're really pleased to have two professors from the University of Sussex, Andy Stirling and Adrian Smith, to talk about their research around this topic. I'm going to start by introducing Andy Stirling, and Andy's going to tell us a little bit about the research that you've done before we move on to a discussion in more detail about the topic.
Sure. So, well, thanks very much for having me. It's great to be here. I've been around for donkey's years in an outfit called the Science Policy Research Unit, which looks at the policy making and politics on science and technology generally, at different times in different places around the world. And my own work, to summarise it really, is looking at the way power works inside science and inside technology and innovation. And I'm particularly enthusiastic about that because I think a lot of the ways in which power works don't really get fully attended to, and it's very directly relevant to this theme today, which we're talking about, of democracy and innovation. Because one of the main things, I think, we'll see how it goes in the conversation, but that blocks an appreciation for what democracy really means in research and innovation is the idea that somehow it just unfolds. Research and innovation is just what the system gives us. It's what comes out the machine. When in fact, there's all kinds of things, different things could come out of both research and innovation, radically different things. And power and how it works in science and technology is one of the main ways in which possible directions or pathways for innovation get closed down and others get really emphasized. So that's the kind of thing I work on across military, nuclear, biotech, at different times, nanoscience, those kinds of areas where you see these kinds of things playing out. And I'm interested in trying to just open up a bit more space for democratic debate about the kinds of science and technology that we want.
Great. I mean, that sounds fantastic stuff. And so we'll come back to Andy shortly. But I also want to introduce our other guest now, Adrian Smith. And Adrian is the author of a book, author of a series of essays called Grassroots Innovation, which is a fantastic book and well worth reading, people. But I want to ask Adrian, to tell me a little bit about the research that you're doing, a little bit about the research around the Grassroots Innovation book, and how it relates, to the topic under discussion today.
Yeah, thanks, Phil, and it's equally nice to be here. I'm a colleague of Andy's, so I also work at the Science Policy Research Unit, where I do research with colleagues around the world, with different kinds of practitioners in different settings, trying to understand how innovation in society can take us towards more sustainable developments, but at the same time how certain patterns of innovation actually are digging us deeper into problematic unsustainabilities. And then, as you mentioned, within that, in recent years, I've been working with colleagues trying to look at innovation beyond the usual suspects, if you like. So what's happening outside of research centres or the labs of large corporations or the public-private partnerships and catapults for promoting technologies and innovation for economic competitiveness and growth. I wanted to important as that is, this research wanted to look at what's happening in neighbourhoods, amongst neighbours, amongst local activists, NGOs, within trades unions, and sort of more civil society kind of organisations that are trying to respond to challenges of sustainable development and local development priorities as they see them, and with their own kind of priorities and interests and understandings to the fore. And so the book you mentioned, this Grassroots Innovations Movements, that came out of a body of work from the STEP Centre at Sussex University. That's a research centre joint between SPRU, where we work, and the Institute of Development Studies, and it was an ESRC funded centre, still is. And we collaborated with people, social, technological and environmental pathways to sustainability. Cool. And we wanted to look, pathways being in the plural, and it picks up on what Andy was saying, in the sense that there are a variety of ways of understanding and trying to be more sustainable, and all sorts of different pathways to, figuring out and getting to some more sustainable kind of futures. What we do when we're looking at these grassroots settings, so for example, we've done projects where we've been looking at community energy initiatives in the UK and how they've developed. We've done research looking at, the sort of growth in hacker spaces and fab labs over the last kind of couple of decades, and other examples around housing, food, food sharing, and always trying to understand, well, who's involved, what are they doing, and why? What kinds of networks are they developing, and how do we understand their successes and their challenges or disappointments as well? And then I think most interestingly, that's all interesting and important, how do they encounter some of these more conventional institutions and policy programs and funders of innovation as conventionally understood? And what kind of entanglements and kind of, synergies, conflicts emerge when you get this kind of grassroots innovation encountering this more incumbent, more powerfully situated models and forms of innovation. And I think that's important, and maybe pertinent to this discussion, is to what extent these grassroots initiatives are redistributing radically the capabilities to prototype in society, to experiment materially with technology, with artifacts, with practices, to do things differently. And that sort of diversity and the skills to do that, I think, are really important for democracy and democratisation, particularly in technological societies like ours.
And so it strikes me that both of you are talking about different models of developing innovation, of creating innovation, from possibly the mainstream models that are kind of most dominant. And Andy, you talked about the fact that to some extent those mainstream models kind of hide the fact that there's power relations involved in the fact that they're dominant.
Yeah.
And often, at least in the world that I inhabit, that model is called the Silicon Valley model.
Yeah.
That we have technologists like Elon Musk who kind of develop new technologies and provide them to society, and that linear approach is the solution. Yeah. But I know your research kind of questions that, and can you tell us a bit more about how you see that dominant model?
So, in a way, one way of doing that is to have a little think about the two words you just used, mainstream and model, because I think it's neither mainstream nor is it a model. And what I mean by that is this: I think generally in countries like the UK, but it's true more generally around the world, at least in my experience, that when we come to the table as we have today with democracy and innovation on the agenda, the default assumption is there's somehow intention, that somehow there's innovation goes on in the innovation system with a lot of expertise, often have to drag, kicking and screaming, society behind it, which, if it intervenes at all, is there some sort of break on it, either deliberately or just inadvertently. And that somehow their intention, science, technology on the one hand, democracy on the other. And all we have to do really is think a bit about the kinds of technologies and innovations that are most enthusiastically supported now, to see that's really quite an odd way of framing it. Because now, for instance, take sustainability that Adrian just referred to, thinking about some of the technologies now, say, to be practical, let's take energy, renewable energy. No matter what side you are on the debate about, for instance, nuclear power on the one hand as a zero carbon candidate, or renewables on the other hand, no matter what side you're on, it's impossible to ignore the fact that renewable energy has just taken off absolutely astoundingly in the last 10 years. It's grown very, very rapidly. It's become, beyond contention now, far more cost-effective in narrow economic terms than nuclear. So where do these renewable energies come from? Take wind power. Just off Brighton here, we've got the Rampion offshore wind array. And it's a really strange story, because back in the 70s, early 80s, the big incumbents, the powerful interests inside electricity systems, did experiment after the oil shock of the 70s with renewable energy. And they tried to scale it up very, very quick. And they decided in Sweden, in USA, in Japan, in Germany, in the UK, almost without exception, we've tried it, it doesn't work. If you look now at the often Chinese wind turbines coming in, the intellectual property, whether it's Danish, German, Chinese companies, a lot of that intellectual property comes from Danish firms. Why Denmark? Well, Denmark, back in the 70s, early 80s, was explicitly not just non-nuclear, but anti-nuclear. It had an anti-nuclear national policy, and it provided a unique environment around the world to nurture initially very small businesses and cooperatives growing up alongside agricultural equipment colleges, doing the kind of things you guys are doing in Fusebox, but on energy, as it were, to develop these what were then really eccentric technologies, which then slowly scaled up. And the intellectual property, key from the gears and a lot of the stuff for the wind turbines now, goes back to that. So the point I'm making is, if it hadn't been for that political environment in Denmark in the 80s, it's quite arguable we would not have wind power at all in the world. It's an example of a pathway that could easily be imagined not to have been followed. And the reason it was followed was because there was a space that was relatively free from these incumbent dominant power centres. So that's just a concrete example of the kind of thing I'm interested in, which is that it's neither mainstream nor a model, because in the end, no one's in the cockpit. There is no cockpit for innovation. It's not like we do it because there's a model. We do it, it's part of politics. Politics shapes innovation as well as it shapes everything else. And if you have a political environment in which certain things can thrive, it's not because there's a model there, it's because power has backed off a bit and other things can come in. And they didn't have a model necessarily. They were just doing their best in ways Adrian's worked with a lot of cooperatives and social movements on. So in the end, innovation, democracy is part of how you make innovation successful, how you find new routes that would otherwise be missed by being democratic about innovation.
I mean, just to continue with that example, it's not like it started off small is beautiful, these wind turbines, and now we have very large turbines offshore or big arrays on land, and they're owned by multinationals, and it's very intensive, capital-intensive technology. But alternatives persist. There's a lot of interest in more community-based and cooperative models, as well as the wind array. We have Brighton Energy Cooperative in the city, which is about cooperatively owned solar panels on roof spaces across the city, and just had to struggle and to be successful. And there are all around the world interest in. It's not like there's one low carbon future and it's all going to be using these large scale renewables or nuclear. If you're thinking about renewables, it's what form should that take? Who has ownership over those sorts of technologies? How is it embedded in your wider patterns of energy consumption or use and so forth? And so there's this sort of flourishing of like, well, actually we need a different kinds of scales of technologies and the different ownership models and so forth. So these democratic struggles, maybe, these arguments over what pathways are best, how they interact, are kind of ongoing, if you like, always ongoing. This politics never really ceases. And it's interesting, you get kind of pushbacks and reactions against that as well, in terms of, what were maybe originally quite countercultural technologies. Apparently, just through these dynamics, and no one being in control, but people just trying to exploit the opportunities and groups and use what power they've got and resources they've got to develop them for their goals, whether be that for private profit or to make a city competitive or whatever. And those shape the dynamics of these technologies. And sometimes some groups think that this thing's been captured or co-opted in some way, and that can provoke innovation to do it differently, to do it in a more inclusive way, or to do it differently. I think a big cleavage there, if you like, is between innovation seen as the production of intellectual property, and knowledge of doing things in novel ways is proprietary and a source of value, versus the whole kind of sort of free knowledge as commons kinds of activities and movements, seeing the best way to promote innovation is to make the knowledge as widely available as possible and allow people to produce value through that knowledge, not by enclosing that knowledge. And that's a real big cleavage now, I think, in a point of division.
So hang on to that, because I'm going to come back to that, because that's a great point. But I just want to pick up on Andy's point. The example you gave of wind turbine technology and Denmark. I was interested in whether you think then that is it just that different types of innovation happens at the margins? And you talked about, in effect, Denmark being a bit of a marginal economy, but also having a public policy around being anti-nuclear. Or is it that you get or do you think that there's a different, just different types of innovation happen in the margins to the centre?
Yeah, definitely different types. The process is different, and the outcome. The processes that Adrian was touching on there, and which we get to talk about, and also the outcomes are both different. And part of it is like let's just think about policy on the one hand and innovation on the other, and the way our discussions about innovation are so distinct. Like, for instance, you routinely get in a country like the UK, USA, European Union, people saying, I'm pro-innovation. And if you find someone criticising your innovation, you say, well, you're being anti-technology. Now, you don't hear, no matter how polarised the politics, when somebody comes in with a new welfare policy or education policy, you don't hear someone in power, a minister maybe, or a senior figure in business, saying of a critic of that policy, you're being anti-policy. It's obviously ridiculous. No one could be anti-policy. They're just anti your policy.
Yeah.
So why is it in innovation, in science and technology, we have this discourse that somehow to be criticised whatever's coming out of the machine is to be anti the whole thing? And so I say that because it's innovation is like policy. Innovation can go in all kinds of directions with all kinds of styles. It's about politics made material by artifacts, by infrastructures, by all the kind of paraphernalia of technology. But it's still about politics. So that's why it's so open. And it does mean that if people have different concerns, like for instance now, take the Sustainable Development Goals, everybody is talking about how important they are, and they are incredibly important. Innovating towards them, the kinds of things that are in the Sustainable Development Goals, trace them back. The environmental issues were back in the 70s when I was first noticing this kind of stuff. They were eccentric interests, avoiding heavy metals, don't dump things in the atmosphere, whether it be chlorofluorocarbons or carbon dioxide, or all these kinds of things were eccentric environmentalist concerns. They weren't mainstream goals for innovation. So it's not just the kinds of innovation themselves, it's the aims, the human aims towards which innovation tries to help us are also political and are also up for grabs. So yes, it really does mean that innovation comes in huge numbers of shapes and sizes.
So the point that you're making, I guess, is that innovation is just seen as an unalloyed good in society, not that certain innovations may be better than other innovations in different ways, either for society or for personal wealth or for individual. And you asked the question, why is that? So I kind of throw that back at you and say, why is that?
Yeah, I think it's about the way power is working in the system. That it's not. I mean, innovation is treated as an unalloyed good. So you have, innovation is great, Britain, and these sort of the government's publicity program at the moment. Meaning, well, what innovation? It's not all great, surely. 40% of public R&D is military. Are we all saying military innovations are just good? There's some issues there. So what they mean is the incumbent innovations, the innovations supported by the most powerful interests, are self-evidently good. And if you don't like them, then you're self-evidently just critical or anti or some pejorative side word. So it's a very polarised debate. It's quite I don't want to be too colourful, but it's quite a totalitarian debate, actually, that we have about innovation. And so part of unleashing the kinds of things that Adrian's working on is to just remove that oppressive dead weight of discussion of innovation that somehow it's only it's my direction or nowhere.
And so how do people who are working in an innovation kind of who accept that rethink the work that they're doing? Do they have to get involved in politics, or is there a way within processes of innovation that you can actually take on board some of the points that you're making? Are there different models?
There certainly are, and that's exactly what Adrian especially has been working on. But however you work on innovation, you're involved in politics. It is political. Innovation is political. It's as political as anything that happens in society. So there's no negotiating that. It's a question of what kind of politics. And for anyone who's pluralistic and democratic, that's not the key issue. We might argue about which kind of innovation, but let's at least have that discussion. Let's make there be different spaces in society for different kinds of innovation to flourish. At the moment, we don't really have that. We have these monocultures.
So, go on.
Yeah, no, I was thinking, I mean, another feature of innovation being such a powerful term in societies at the moment is almost as it's seen sometimes almost as a magic wand. You can solve some of our social problems or economic difficulties with more innovation, and then that opens up all the questions, Andy saying, well, of what type, what processes, with what kinds of outcomes. There's that. But actually, I think then that actually takes you back to some of these problems. A bit of innovation isn't necessarily going to address them because they're deeply structural. The root causes of some of these problems can be deeply structural in societies. So it's to do with who has economic power, who gets to decide what kinds of investments are worth making, what the kind of rules are and so forth, who has access to decision-making centres and so forth. And actually, a lot of the, what becomes a dominant form of innovation, or the shapes that technologies take, are shaped by those sorts of processes about who has privileged access to investment, who can shape a public debate, such as one around, say, the fourth industrial revolution, and trying to interconnect a lot of these, platform technologies, Internet of Things, new kind of, cyber systems and so on and so forth, and a new wave of automation and so forth. And that's kind of like a narrative or a future vision that's being promoted by World Economic Forum, by the national governments worried about they have to keep up with the frontiers of technology, as argued for by the vendors of those technologies and so forth. So when you begin talking about, well, maybe we can use some of these technologies in other ways, more creative ways, as people are, in Fusebox and what have you, trying to think, okay, how do we make, devices that are much more durable, maybe, have a bit more autonomy and aren't so dependent on some of the more incumbent sort of platform providers and so on and so forth, that are more inclusive, where algorithms are more inclusive of the assumptions and values of, different social groups and not simply the coders who are at the heart of things. When you're trying to open up spaces for those sorts of initiatives, if you like, and give them greater resources and room to develop, and argue that kind of vision, then you're getting to some of the root causes of power, I think. It doesn't tend to be those. You don't see many kind of hack spaces having stalls at party conferences, for example. You don't see them talking at Davos and so forth. Yeah. So a lot of the technological visions and directions for innovation now are kind of influenced, not determined, but influenced quite sharply by some of those sorts of arenas. And so I think getting back to, if democracy is the ability to challenge power in that way, to reveal it and to argue against it and propose alternatives and get a voice and get access to decision-making processes, then we really do need these spaces where people are, experimenting with technologies, prototyping activities, say around urban food or different forms of housing, and so on and so forth, to engender broader diversity, I think, and to just make the wider publics aware that there are other ways of we don't always have to kind of conform to technologies as being promoted by certain interests. There are kind of others, other kind of ways to go if we wanted to, and I think that's just really important kind of democratic capability, if you like.
So, do you have any examples, maybe, of democratic innovation in action? Because I think, people may think, yes, it sounds like a good idea, but can it happen, and where is it happening?
Yeah, a really nice example I like is, this isn't the only one, but you're getting these sort of like repair cafes. And there's a group based in London called Restart Project. They've been going for a number of years now, who organise meetups where you take your broken electronics and there's volunteers there who will help you fix your own device. Okay, so it's a very community-oriented activity, and it has practical benefits. You can get, a kind of loved old radio working again, or your, screen changed on your phone or the laptop working again, and so forth. So there's that, but it's also...
But where's the innovation? That sounds like
well,
sustainability.
the innovation is in the organisation of the event and the activity, and creating a space where then people can talk about why is it so difficult to fix this thing? Why is this component glued into the laptop? Why is it not a kind of modular thing that we could simply unscrew? And that's to do with the conveniences of, say, mass production and keeping costs down and so forth. Why is it there are designs out there, people have been researching and developing design for remanufacture for decades, but it's not widely practiced. Why is that? So suddenly then you're getting into conversations like we're having here about the politics of why we get the technologies we do. Also, this Restart project started and working with similar sister initiatives, mobilising a campaign for the right to repair and influencing European legislation being proposed by the European Commission and now being approved by the member states for improving the kind of criteria, the repairability of some of our electronic goods and services, and saving from being dumped in countries outside Europe all of this toxic electronic waste and being so wasteful. So it's a kind of simple innovation, if you like, because the alternative, I mean, the other way of going about doing that maybe would be to organise a meeting above a pub on a Tuesday night to talk about, global manufacturing system and its political economy or something, and you're not going to get many people coming along. I don't know, Andy might, and I might, but whereas this more hands-on, practical way of engaging with your technologies and devices can create a community and a discussion in much more creative ways and make people experience very physically, almost viscerally, some of these big abstract processes. I can't get this processor out and swap it easily. Why is that? Yeah. And you get into all of this stuff. So, but if you like, that's kind of democratising innovation.
And really, it's difficult to look in any sector without finding examples like that one. I mean, the energy sector Adrian referred to earlier, you find the same kind of things. Food, I mean, here in Brighton, is a really vibrant centre for innovation in food, production, distribution, retail, and it's bedded into all kinds of, thinking about ecologically about agriculture, it's box schemes, it's community gardens, and it's linking into the welfare system. There's all kinds of really innovative thinking about this, one of the most important parts of our lives, which is how we get food. So, I think that this is innovation is, sometimes it doesn't get thought about as innovation because it doesn't seem to involve high-tech kit, but often there has to be high-tech kit, but there's also quite often really important roles for, it's not like a high-low technology divide. There can be high technologies coming in to help manage the information in these kinds of innovations as well. Often they're enabled by that.
There are interesting examples also where technologies can help in the practice of democracy, not about how do we democratise the technology, but what kinds of technologies can help people be democrats. And a project we finished not so long ago, again funded by ESRC, was looking at sort of smart cities from below, and we were looking at a number of specific case studies, but the one that's pertinent here, I think, is Can
you just explain what you mean by a smart city?
So smart cities is, it's how one can insert sensors that are interconnected over, by radio or Wi-Fi, and basically measure what's going on in a city in real time, and use that to better manage and govern or run cities more efficiently. So you're kind of trying to turn the city into a computer, if you like. Anything from as sort of important and daily as sensing when dustbins and refuse are filling up and need changing, or irrigating parks, the flow of traffic, and apps where people can identify free parking spaces, or when the buses are coming. So using that interconnectivity and that ability to generate and use data across the urban fabric. Yeah. Now a lot of that has evolved and it's another one of these very kind of top-down visions, and what began as a new market for computer vendors, let's supply to the city authority or the urban kind of market, then developed into this encompassing vision of what a smart city is. And we were interested in initiatives that were kind of using similar technologies, maybe like open hardware, like Arduino kind of microcontrollers and open sensors and chips, and what neighbours and citizens were doing for themselves to use these devices as they saw fit. Yeah, we were also interested in this project in what kinds of knowledge or information get privileged in that. Does the undoubted advantages of some of this computational capability kind of eclipse other forms of knowledge, like what the neighbours know about what really happens in the neighbourhood, some of the social dynamics and so on and so forth. And these sensors come in and create data, and you kind of presume then that you know with the big data what's going on. But actually, if you really want to know what's going on, and to use that effectively, you've got to know, you have lots of good anthropological knowledge as well about what's going on. So we were studying all of that, and one example of what was interesting, and one of the studies we were looking at was Barcelona, which was a pioneer in smart cities for many years, always top ranked in all of these business rankings and so forth. And then with a change in political control of the council, one of these new left parties, Barcelona en Comú, winning it, they wanted to kind of, talked about going beyond the smart city and actually, they got voted into office on promoting greater democracy in Barcelona. And a similar kind of thing happened in Madrid as well. And one of the things they instituted was the development of digital platforms, computer platforms where citizens could make proposals for what should go on in the city and vote on those proposals and deliberate on them online. So they were trying to instigate, bring into the city policy processes, a kind of direct democracy platform that could work at scale. And they did it slightly differently in each city. But I think the important thing, though, is it came in as a kind of, the backdrop to it was this political commitment to deepening and broadening democracy in both cities. Okay, and the people who had developed the platforms, who were brought into the council to do it, had come from social movements that went right back to kind of 15M and before, like the Indignados, who were protesting the crisis in Spain and in Catalonia at the time, and the economic problems and so forth. And they just started off using Reddit and various sort of packages to orchestrate their activities and these large city square discussions and votes. And what do we do? Because these were like quite spontaneous, not readily formed party kind of happenings or political moments. So using ICT in these ways, and then they began developing their own free software for some of these sorts of functionings. And then when parties are emerging from the same movements, one control of the cities there was some public resource to not only implement this form of citizen participation, but to further develop the software as well, which is what they did in Barcelona. And now cities are taking it up, dozens and dozens of cities around the world are using these platforms. But
so is it
it's
an
a
approach
technology
that you'd recommend for other cities?
Well, no, because the other way you could do it...
unique to Barcelona?
No. I mean, they're using it in many different cities, around Europe, in France as well. There may be some in the UK, I'm unaware of it. But interestingly, out of this same kind of innovative milieu, you also get some large companies developing. Telefonica developed citizen participation package, some startups as well. I know the Mayor of London used one of these packages for a specific consultation activity in the city there. But it's a sort of different, with that, all you're getting a company providing a service that you contract in, which is kind of like the smart city model. You just contract in this provision of a platform for citizens to get involved, express their views, vote, and then that's it. It's just an input to an unchanged policy process. Yeah. Whereas what they were trying to do in Barcelona and Madrid was to embed it more in the policy processes of the city by building the capability up alongside that and in-house. So with some of these proposals, there's a commitment to implement them So that means then getting your city engineers, if there's a vote to remodel the square or provide more safe houses for women fleeing violence, domestic violence or what have you, whatever comes up on the platform and gets enough votes or support, you've got to act and implement on that. So that means a commitment to changing the way your administration works as well. In other words, the platform has to begin to embed into the council itself, and people have to be convinced it's worth working and running with. And in Madrid, 100 million euros each year is how it's spent is decided through participants on the platform. The other thing it has to embed with is citizens. Remember, these were platforms that came up through activism, technology developed through activism, where everyone's already committed and wanting to participate. But when you kind of then try and roll it out to people who maybe don't want to be so active or have suspicions or have a history of feeling marginalised, and you have to come up with reasons for it to be meaningful and worthwhile to them. And again, that's involved experiments in the cities with accompanying this platform with more old school, old-fashioned, low-tech community development activities to then help people organise and mobilise around the issues that matter to them, take them to the platforms and get more wider citizen kind of involvement in it and develop a kind of collective intelligence. I've gone on about this example at length, and it's not perfect by any stretch, but it's an example of a technology that can help further democracy, but it only works if you've got a prior commitment to democracy, and the important processes are as much to do with what's happening offline and the local community development, democracy capabilities, as is happening online and with the technology developers. And that was assisted by the creation of labs and reflection points. It was all done very transparently. Anyone could come along to development meetings and so forth. And I think it gets back to this opening up technologies when and where appropriate to really allow kind of inputs and challenging the interrogations. And none of it, this sort of evolved and emerged, the story I'm telling you. It wasn't sort of designed from day one, in Plaza de Catalunya or Sol in Madrid with the protests. You know what we're going to do in 6 years' time? We're going to be deciding how loads of money is spent, in a council. It sort of evolved and emerged, and central to that was having capabilities and knowledge, social and technological, available locally, and networks you could connect and draw to. And I think that's what we need to... I think we've got, in societies, there is this redistribution of prototyping capabilities going on. There's all sorts of talented people and places, like Fusebox. But I think we're still figuring out how to develop the institutions and the programs and the networks to connect it and to really tap into the potential.
Can I just pick up on that last point with you then, Andy? Because I know, something that you've researched and written about a lot is uncertainty in innovation activity. And I wonder if you can unpick what that means, because I think to a lay person that would suggest that we don't really know what's going to happen, and so how can we possibly plan?
Sure.
Is that what's meant by it, or is it?
Yeah, it is. So it hinges on some points Adrian's making about knowledge and the politics of knowledge. And that's why I emphasise in some of the earlier things I said about the way we think about innovation, our imagination of what innovation is. And so picking up this point about uncertainty, in the dominant imagination of what innovation is, it's something that goes along a particular line. And then society is allowed to ask the question, what risk is tolerable? It's actually not, I've been on some of these advisory committees, they don't look at what's acceptable, they look at what's tolerable for chemicals or biotech. It's quite interesting how they work. And in fact, that's now underpinned by the World Trade Organization, who don't allow countries increasingly to do anything on new technologies other than use risk assessment. So the imagination of innovation is kind of interesting. It's that it goes along a path, there's a one-track race, countries are at different stages, some people are winning, some people are losing. You're allowed to do risk assessment. That means putting probabilities on different possible outcomes. So what's missing there, if we now think of our conversation so far, is, well, hang on a minute, it's just about that dominant line, whatever is supposed to be the dominant pathway, you get to ask what risk. But what about all the other pathways? So already, uncertainty is massively deeper and broader than we talk about, because uncertainty is not just about what might be the risk of this path, it's which path? Much more broad. And then secondly, because all these institutions of risk assessment, whether it's biotech or chemicals or energy, AI, robotics now, risk assessment is what's done. What about situations you haven't foreseen, that you haven't got a basis for putting a probability? Risk assessment just puts its hands over its ears, doesn't want to hear that. It's just all about what you can assign a probability with. So there's a whole body of thinking about that called precautionary principle, about being precautionary, about things which we cannot put probabilities on. So it's a politics of knowledge, because no matter what side of the fence we're on politically, it tends to be all sides are thinking about innovation in a similar way. So for instance, it's easy, characters like Adrian and I, we may be in danger of romanticising the social movements. I was talking about them earlier in a very glowing light. But social movements aren't immune to this kind of narrow imagination. If whatever their favourite innovation is, they'll be very close to people asking difficult questions. So there's big companies like Monsanto producing gene-edited crops, which get questioned in various places around the world, in my view rightly. There's also biohackers who take exactly the same view about anyone's right to criticise what they might do in their kitchen. So it's not just about looking at big business and saying what it's doing. It's the imagination, the politics of knowledge around uncertainty is similar across the board. So we don't just need to let in different groups to do the same kind of innovation. We need everyone to be asking broader questions about, well, what about the things we haven't thought about? Who stands to lose most if this goes wrong? And unless the innovators are asking those questions, if we bring in a social group to do innovation of the same old kind but in a slightly different way, and they still don't ask these questions about who might actually suffer from this thing if it goes wrong, then we haven't really achieved a lot. So we need to do all the kinds of things we've been talking about, but we also need to change the kinds of questions, not just what's the risk, but what kind of innovation do we want, who says, and who stands to lose, how do we actually address that?
So in a way, uncertainty is a way of being able to say there are alternatives, there are alternative paths that we could pursue. Is that?
Yeah, well, I get terribly enthusiastic about some of these words, but yes, it is about that, absolutely. But it's about basically saying it's not just one way and what risk. It's about what are the things we don't know about? What are the unknown unknowns, to use a phrase that was contaminated? Well, it's interesting. A character like him, who's very bullish, to put it mildly, only gets to acknowledge there are unknown unknowns when utter failure and humiliation, in that case of a failed, appalling, obscene war, which failed. So it's interesting that the system will acknowledge it's failed under these crises, and that leaves a space then for the kind of social movements to come in and do other things. So yes, the only times we tend to acknowledge there are unknown unknowns is when it's undeniable. Like BSE did it when there was a consumer campaign against GMOs, that did it. The ozone hole did it. People have to admit, oh, yikes, that was a surprise. And then you get a space for a short period for people asking broader questions about innovation. So that's part of it. So partly it's about different choices, partly it's about people disagreeing. There's no one right answer to innovation challenges, and part of it's about surprises and unknowns. And there's things we can do on all sides of these debates to take more account of that.
It's interesting because both of you seem to be talking about trying to create spaces where people can innovate or create new things or do things in better ways, innovative methods, I guess. In terms of communities or social groups, but also in terms of, I suppose a nation state in terms of Denmark, to take your kind of initial idea. How do you feel about the ways that those innovations can scale effectively? Because that seems to be one of the challenges of what you're both talking about, actually. So you talked about Andy. You talked about the work that was done in Denmark and places is now kind of owned by big multinationals, and Adrian, you're talking about these small groups, but the closer those small groups get to powerful interests, which they maybe need to do in order to scale, the more that their democratic instincts might be kind of compromised. Yeah. So I'm kind of interested in the question of scaling democratic innovation here.
Yeah.
I think, this question of scaling is one of those that is sort of hardwired into us. It's almost like an initiative. It's not worth persisting with if it can't scale up in some way. And you're right, it brings all sorts of challenges and difficulties and opportunities as well. But it tends to come from this way we think about innovations. You do your prototypes and you get a good working commodity and you market it and it kind of scales. Or you figure out ways to do, the innovating firms grow and so forth. But for some of these initiatives, they're not really that interested in scaling as understood like that. That's a sort of imposition by a powerful way of thinking about innovation. And they may be more interested in how they build on what they've done locally. They've created, say, renewable energy cooperatives. Why can't we do something in food now? Or let's try and expand into refurbishing housing for people, the disadvantaged groups or whatever. And all sorts. It's about growing out in the neighbourhood or territory. Yeah. Right. Or they're interested in circulating their initiatives around so that others in other places can learn how to do it from them. So that kind of circulation is a different way of thinking about what makes something successful compared to this need to scale up, if you like.
So that's another example.
Sorry, Andy. I had to go and I remember I was at the OECD in Paris once. I had the good fortune to be invited there to talk about some of these things, and I had a real tumbleweed moment because they were asking about inclusive innovation and how do you scale this up, and it was about how do you help people develop entrepreneurial skills to market what they're doing. And there's nothing wrong with that, and that's a really good way to scale things when it's appropriate. But I was pointing out some of the things like we've been discussing here and saying maybe the real question is how do you scale down your institutions and take decisions and resources closer to people or to groups and to smaller scale entrepreneurs and, leave Whitehall and wherever these big research agendas are set and go out and decentralise and regionalise your innovation systems and so forth. And this scaling down point, that was the tumbleweed moment. Yes. It was a big room full of representatives and
because it was too tricky. Far outside the kind of the perspective, the paradigm.
Yeah, I was not talking. I stepped out with this point momentarily from the terms of discussion. And the imagination and the sorts of forms of knowledge and way of reasoning about these things that were acceptable. And we were having coffee after, in the break, people were coming up to me and sort of saying, it's really interesting, or we're trying to do that in Colombia or wherever, and so on and so forth. So it sort of happens, but it's always maybe on the margins a little bit.
So that's why I was talking about the politics of knowledge, really. How we think really matters. It's not just where you are inside this same imagination of innovation. So that's why I picked up on the idea of models of innovation, because in that idea that somebody's planned it, it's a model, and then it gets implemented. Or the idea of risk, that the risk involves putting a probability, everyone's doing it, and here we're scaling up. That implies a kind of cockpit from which things get scaled up. You pull a lever and scale it up or scale it down. When, as Adrian was saying, it's a lot of these processes are much more like, if you think about how social movements achieve progressive change, like think of women's emancipation or the workers' rights or decolonisation. It wasn't somebody saying, okay, now's the time to scale up. They just thrived out. When they caught the imagination of others, they thrived outwards and grew in the way that Adrian's talking about. And innovation can be just like that as well. It's a very narrow model of innovation, that it is a model that you measure risk and then you scale it up, implying, and that's why Adrian's OECD chums, any kind of innovation, like as long as it's a multinational doing it, like with wind power, with IP that they claim, any kind of innovation can fit that system as long as it's got these certain sorts of forms that are usable within that imagination. But if you start thinking about open source, you start thinking about it's a social movement doing it, it's not a corporate setting, then you start finding So it's not either or.
There's,
They can both work.
There's an art.
Because
Really great.
Just to give Andy a follow-up question there.
Sure.
So I'm just kind of interested then, because it strikes me that the best of innovations, good innovation is necessary really because we face incredible challenges as a society and as a planet, and we've got to come up with better ways, and that may well mean new ways of doing things. Yeah. But we've also got the challenge of making sure that they impact those positive changes impact as many people as possible. Yes. I'm just would you I'm just trying to understand how we do that if we just take Adrian's tumbleweed suggestion of small and localized.
Yes. Well, I think that's a really great question. So there are, even within say, take the environment movement as a pocket of areas, and some of the biggest challenges, like obviously climate disruption, massive challenge, biodiversity loss. There's some really different ways of thinking about innovation in those areas. So one of them, ironically now growing, is we've got no time for this. We need to do stuff. We've got 5 years to save the planet. Do the solution now. This is the solution. Get on with it. It's just like the very techno-fix, top-down, authoritarian, do what the science says. Do what the science says is what some part of the climate movement is saying now, as if science tells you what to do. Science never tells you what to do. The only people who used to say science tells you what to do were big corporations like Monsanto saying science tells us to do this particular innovation. So it's really interesting now how some of this language, some of this politics of innovation is being picked up in the environment movement itself. Yeah. Whereas if you go back to some of the...
Well, in progressive movements generally, I think because of
that's true.
The rise of populism, which has almost become an anti-science movement.
Right. But what is chicken and what is egg? I don't know, but I'm saying that you could as easily tell a story that authoritarian populism is a reaction to this overbearing expertise. Experts are always appearing like us, in front of cameras, banging on about what should be done and shouldn't be done. And like Michael Gove's plague on experts, it's as much that it's as much that expertise has been overbearing in what's its claims. Scientists have claimed too much about what they can say about what we should do in the world. It's only part of the mix. It's an essential part, but it's only part of the mix. And so when environmentalists start coming in with arguments like 5 years to save planet, do what the science says, then they're as much provoking authoritarian populism as they are a sort of a solution to it. I think it's part of the. It's quite. So I think
what's an alternative approach?
Right. So then take the SDGs I mentioned. Which is a very high level discourse. It's very different from the kind of
Sustainable Development Goals.
Thank you. Yeah, the Sustainable Development Goals. There's 17 of them. There's 169 targets. It's very open. The Economist called them the stupid development goals because there's so many. Right. Because you can't have them in a cockpit. You can't have a dashboard with a top-down sort of model. But I think it's really quite interesting. The SDGs came out of political struggle, and they're not there for someone to be in a cockpit with a dashboard. They're there for social movements to do the kinds of things Adrian and I have been talking about, innovating, lobbying, mobilizing, with lots of small businesses involved in that too, to challenge some of the main. There's not a blueprint for it, and so that model is not involving someone saying we've got 5 years, what's the plan? It's here are some compasses. It's always been about politics. Let's let these different kind of movements thrive and rely more on bottom-up, grassroots, political mobilisation with small businesses as part of that, as a very broad sense of politics, to actually achieve these ends. And when the time is right, if you look at past social transformations, it's like flocking birds, then there's no one in charge. But when it turns the corner, it can do it very, very rapidly, as happened with the welfare state, as happened with women's emancipation, decolonisation. These things, when the time is right, they happen very quick. And they're innovation, transformative innovation, but they're quite different from how we speak of it.
I'm going to start to bring this to a fascinating and brilliant, though this has been, and it really has been really kind of interesting. I'm just going to kind of start to bring it to a close. Adrian, I wonder if you can just kind of summarise, if you can, your thoughts around this issue of how communities engage with technology and democratic innovation.
No, thanks, Phil, and thanks for the questions. It's been really good. I think, I mean, a good way.
Easy, actually,
I think a good way of summarising
so
it. A good way of summarising it is probably something that an engineer called Mike Cooley said, who sadly died recently, and the president of Ireland said he's one of Ireland's greatest engineers, and he talked about present tense technologies. So these are kind of future technologies, let's say like robotics, but they're using present tense imaginations or the interests of the current incumbents who enjoy powerful, privileged positions. And I think that's where we're at with a lot of innovation policy at the moment. We're just developing present tense technologies. We're being disruptive so that everything stays the same. And that's really problematic when we're confronting things like biodiversity loss, soil degradation, inequalities, rampant inequalities, climate change, etc. Is present tense technologies aren't going to do it. We need to open up, and I think that's the point, the simple point we've been making, or I've been trying to make in this discussion, is one way of opening up is to begin to listen actively and look carefully at what's going on more widely, what people and groups are doing. And it's not necessarily all just sort of grassroots groups, volunteers or small things. It may be industrial sectors in other parts of the world that's looking at things differently, and so on and so forth. And just seeking out and encouraging that diversity to then open up discussions and deliberations about the plurality of pathways that may make sense to get us into a much more future-oriented, much more sustainable set of technologies.
Yeah, and I very much agree with that. And just to add a little, don't be told no, you can't do it. Don't accept authority. There's the motto of the Royal Society of all things, when it started out back in the 17th century, was nullius in verba, not on authority. Don't take the authority of anyone. Talk about it, argue about it, get evidence. That was the kind of founding values of science. And it's interesting now, several hundred years later, that Royal Society reports get slammed down on the desk with this motto, not on authority, but they're actually, science itself has become the very kind of doctrine that it originally opposed. It was a social movement. It was a democratic social movement for more democratic knowledge. And I think we need to find some of the origins of science as well. It's not about science in tension with democracy. It's about refinding the democracy in science. And the way to open up in the way Adrian's talking about is to just, in a thousand different ways, don't be intimidated by the structures of society saying, no, that can't be done. This is the authoritative view on it. Just get that bit of space, challenge, and it'll be amazing, I think, what kinds of worlds we can actually achieve. It's much broader than we think.
Okay. All right. This has been a fascinating discussion, and I'd like to thank Adrian and Andy for joining us. And I'm now going to say goodbye to you all at home, and thank you for watching.